Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV 9.
Good morning. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives in the News. My name is Pete Welch, and I'm the moderator for this morning's show. This morning, we'd like to visit about something we've heard about a lot in the news lately, and what's going on in respect to defense spending in this country, and how our politicians and others may describe or view defense spending as a necessity or a requirement, or just how they do view it. At any point, we're going to hear a lot about it in the next 6 months during leading to the election and after the election with our lame duck Congress, and we hope to educate everybody a little bit more on what that's all about tonight. With us first this morning is Mr. Paul Ronan, who's a retired strategic planner at Rockwell Collins here in Cedar Rapids. Retired Air Force bird colonel, is that correct?
Correct.
And how many years service?
30.
30, okay. And with us next this morning is Mr. Carl Knudsen, who is with the Workers for Peace with Iowa. He's a retired school teacher and a veteran of the Vietnam conflict. Good morning, Carl.
Good morning.
And last but not least is Dr. Steve Reagan. Dr. Steve Reagan is a retired collegiate professor and dean, and he's a military historian, having done a biographer of the Iowa-born Admiral Fletcher that many of us have heard about in World War II fame. So, Dr. Reagan, thank you for joining us this morning. Anyway, when I chose this topic and wanted to talk about it, it's a very large topic when we talk about defense spending. But one of the things I thought we would be talking would be about defense versus the overall impact. One of the things we're all hearing is what's happening to the budget of the United States, and we'll try and concentrate on that this morning. One of the things I did in my research is we're talking about what defense spending is. And in the research, post-conflict, and we have all been through a few of these now, is there has been a rush of the government to take what was spent previously on wars to come back and spend on other areas of the economy. Steve, you were in during the Vietnam era along with others. Any thoughts on what this spending is all about?
Well, I think the George Washington quote, "In time of peace, plan for war. In time of war, plan for peace." And I think that you always need to be looking forward as to what your needs are. It seems that after many conflicts, the immediate rush to slash the defense spending and put it in other programs, we've come to regret it later on down the pike. This happened after World War I, after World War II, certainly after Vietnam, and may very well, once the Middle East is quieted, may also come to fruition. That, I think, is a major issue to take a serious look at.
I'd like to interject that I'm not sure if the American public is really aware of how much our defense spending is. It's upwards of $600 billion, and that is greater than the rest of the world combined. And if you compare that with the next largest spender, which is China, their amount spent is about $60 billion. So I think, bringing up some of our past leaders, like Steve brought up Washington, General Eisenhower, when he was president in 1960 in his farewell address, said the public should really be aware of the industrial complex, the military-industrial complex. And I'm afraid that his worst fears have come to fruition, because I think the way it looks to me is that the military-industrial tail is wagging the American economy's dog. And so we're talking about cuts here since the super committee did not reach an agreement on 1.2 trillion cuts, then the sequestration had to take place, which is a mandated cuts in the Pentagon, and that really is only $55 billion, and that's just, you know, about 10% of the whole budget.
I guess I'm somewhere in the middle on this. It is interesting, your point is well taken, that the United States spends more than half of the world's military budget. And certainly that affects our economy. You can't just walk away from that. We have to gradually pare it down. But a tremendous amount of that spending is on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, Iraq's over. We ought to be cutting that spending out. And certainly we need to go back then and look at ourselves once again. You know, where are we as a nation? What do we want to do? Do we want to be able to fight 2 major wars and another half a war somewhere? If we do, then there's a price you got to pay. I don't think we do. I don't think we have that many enemies right now that are capable of threatening us in the way that they were during the Cold War, and yet we still have the types of budgets as a percent of GDP that we had during the Cold War. I believe there's plenty of room for cutback in the military, and to your point, the 10%, I just think of the numbers here. The Air Force, which I came from, has 13 4-star generals. 13 4-star generals. Hell, during before World War II, there weren't any. I think the Navy had one, or one admiral or something. So do we really need this kind of staffing if we're not going to be fighting a major war, which God forbid we would? I think there's plenty of room to cut in the military. And of course, they'll whine and scream, but I believe there's room to cut.
Paul, I'd like to just make a couple of notes. One being that indeed, none of us will disagree with the figures of almost $700 billion a year. We have, as a nation, as a power, a moral and ethical responsibility to safeguard basic human rights, the rights of self-determination. We're the only superpower left, and we're the only ones remaining that can keep the Gaddafis, the Saddam Husseins, terrorists at a minimum. Now, whether we want to be the moral conscience of the world, that's a debatable issue. I personally feel we don't have an argument there. I personally feel we do have a moral responsibility, and that means that it is up to the United States, because of our power, because of our international interests. We're going to have to be that person. The other thing that that I think is very important to take into consideration is, partially because of our position in the world, we have greater responsibilities at greater depths and in many varied ways than we ever did before. Unlike a World War II or even Vietnam, we're now dealing with undersea capabilities. We're dealing with Cyber Command, the U.S. Cyber Command. We know that China has attempted twice to infiltrate and destroy our whole internet grid works. We're looking at small, what we used to call brush fire wars, if you will, like the Middle East. We're lacking in tankers. We're lacking in freighters. We've just got a heck of a lot more things to do and more diverse needs than we've ever had in our history. And then you throw in the modern technology with the unmanned aviation vehicles, the unmanned, and that's a non-sexist remark, uncrewless submarine, surface ships. The technology is growing faster than our abilities to even keep up with it. So those are issues that I think need to be firmly and realistically dealt with in terms of cuts.
Now that may be, but I think we could probably do a whole different show on this if we talk about the role of whether the United States as a superpower is going to be the policeman of the world. I think what we've seen in the last number of conflicts is trying to a consensus build and go in as either a NATO force or a joint force. And I think you try and build a consensus and get a better response. Wouldn't you agree on that?
I certainly would. I joined the Workers for Peace Iowa after I heard the President Bush and Vice President Cheney laying the groundwork and building up a case for war, and I'm listening to it on the radio or watching on TV. I'm saying, oh no, didn't we not learn anything from Vietnam? And I knew it was specious. It was like the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and I saw a savage tableau of maimed soldiers, dead soldiers, families burying their children, and I'm so disappointed that we cannot, as you mentioned, go around policing up the whole world. And I think it was a terrible mistake to have gone into Iraq. I mean, this administration did not know the difference between a Sunni and a Shia, and that was very germane to the whole issue after the fighting stopped, and I don't think it's going to stop in the near future. But we've got to be careful with our power. I think we went into Vietnam not knowing a bit of the Vietnamese history. If people had studied that history, and we were so afraid of China and Vietnam being a single block of communism, if we had studied the history of Vietnam, we would have found that Vietnam fought several wars against China for their independence because they were first conquered by China in 111 BC. They had a revolution in 39 BC, 539 AD. Finally, in 938 AD, they finally broke the shackles of the Chinese domination. And then they had their independence until 1247, I believe. Kublai Khan, the Mongol emperor of China, decided he would like to control Vietnam. He loved all the rice and so on down there, and they liked to make a buffer around China. Vietnam was the only country that resisted successfully the Kublai Khan army. So if we had studied this history of Vietnam, I don't think we ever would have gone in there, and because I don't think we would have seen them as a communist bloc with China and so on. So, long story, we've got to be very careful and study our history before we commit our young men and women to these wars of choice. 4,000 dead in Iraq. We're up to 2,000 now in Afghanistan. So we really need to be aware of our role in the world and the opinion the world has of us.
I think, Carl, I'm very much in agreement with you as a historian. Those that don't know their history are doomed to repeat it. And like you, I also felt that going into the Middle East had many of the looks of Vietnam. I think you have to take things at the time that they occur. The knowledge we had and the perspectives we had in 1954 when Eisenhower initially supported the nationalistic Vietnamese after the French were defeated was a mistake. But I'm not sure we wouldn't make that same mistake today under the same circumstances and the same beliefs that we had at that point. Nevertheless, I agree that ignorance has been a significant component in many of our conflicts, both internal and internationally. Without that, we have some serious issues.
I'd like to add one thing there. Sure. That, here we spend 4% of our GDP or some number like that. It was in your notes. Our European allies spend less than 2%, more like 1%. We went into Libya, everybody accused us of leading from behind. Well, what's wrong with that? And it turns out that without us, the French and British couldn't have pulled it off because they didn't have the logistics trained. They ran out of bombs and bullets. They didn't have the suppression of enemy air defenses that they needed up front. They didn't have the surveillance. So even though we didn't have any boots on the ground, and they did most of the attacking, we provided the logistics. Why do we have to do that? They're as rich as we are. We have the same principles. We ought not to be going to war on our own, I don't believe. We ought to be going to war as a member of a coalition, and that coalition has been NATO. So why are we having to fund the lion's share of NATO and be the one that has to be there? I don't think we should. And that's, you know, I kind of tend to agree with you about the Bush-Cheney thing. That just appalled me. I can't believe we did that and we let those people do that to us and lead us down that garden path. You mentioned we lost 5,000 young men and women there.
4,000.
4,000,
yeah.
But how many did the Iraqis lose?
Yeah.
200, 300,000 killed? Certainly we haven't raised our standing in the Middle East by what we've done. So I think unless we're going in as part of a coalition, we ought to just back off and say, no, we're just not going to do that.
Those are excellent points. I'm sorry.
But Paul, as a fellow military person who spent 30 years in, let's not forget that while people can sit and point at the military, that the military really does the bidding not of the historians, not of the military, but that of the politicians.
Of course.
And so, you know, where people might lay blame saying it was the military that did this, it was really the politicians. And I don't disagree that sometimes having political oversight of the military gives the sense of perspective to the military, because they're trained to do a different thing than consider social balance to what they're doing. And I think you could even speculate about how it is that we in the United States have always been guilty of, you know, fighting the last war we were in the next struggle. It was the last battle's technology. And so how to, you know, maybe there's a way we could break out of that.
I personally believe that the other nations, particularly our allies, have, for a variety of reasons, legitimate and sometimes not so, have abrogated their responsibilities to world peace, if you will. I think England has been supportive of the United States, but they certainly don't put their money where their mouths are. France has completely abrogated their responsibilities. Italy, of course, is in huge financial crisis. Greece is in huge Interestingly enough, Spain is in serious financial issues as well. But long before these issues came up, they've kind of talk big, but they don't open up their pocketbooks in terms of support.
Yeah. Well, I think the image of the United States in the world is very important, and we would be admired much more if we didn't abuse our power. But, for example, I have returned to Vietnam, sort of a 40th anniversary of when I was drafted and went over there as an infantry grunt. And I returned after my retirement, and I created a website to share what I observed and so on, and that website is www.vietviews.com. That's vietviews.com. But anyway, you'll find on there several ways that the Vietnamese people have been very kind in their acceptance of an American traveling around. I remember looking for Long Binh, the largest post in the world at the height of the Vietnam War. There were 60,000 troops stationed there. It was like stateside. I was there briefly when I went through and ended up in the Central Highlands. But I was looking for remains of that post because it was huge, barracks as far as you can see. There was nothing, not a stick of evidence that there was ever a post there. And somebody saw me walking around looking, and he said something in Vietnamese, and the taxi driver answered him, crazy Americans looking for Long Binh or something. And he said, oh, come on over. And the taxi driver could speak English and Vietnamese. But long story short, this gentleman was about 58 years old. He had been a VC, and his neighbor joined us, and he had been a VC. And I told him that I had fought over here too, but we ended up, they were so generous and kind. We shook hands. I have a picture of it. But I have been to various museums in Vietnam, And the image of the United States is not good. And I cringe when I see all these Australians looking through this museum. But I felt worse at My Lai. My website has extensive coverage of My Lai, and that is not a very happy chapter in our military's record. But so anyway, our image in the world is very important, and it should be corrected and not be so militaristic. One more point. There are 760 American bases throughout the world. That is just seems like over the top for what we need to be spending money on. It's like Rome, you know, they had all these bases all over the world, and they pretty soon went broke because of various reasons we can't go into.
But you know, so much of that is political. And again, I go back to what Pete said. Our NATO allies like to have that security so that they don't have to pay for their own. Just as we ran into with trying to close bases here in the United States. Every time somebody wanted to close down a base in Texas, you know,
yep. Congress, yeah.
Texas congressional leaders and oil money, you know, just raised Cain. And again, it gets back. But Pete, I'd like to talk just a moment about that large sum of money, $700 billion.
Well, what we're talking about here is, at the end of this year, the failure of the super committee to come up. This is something our public's going to be hearing an awful lot about between now and the end of the year, and this is the sequestration poison pill. One half of that is going to fall straight on DOD.
What I'm concerned about is that within the United States, for better or for worse, we're going to just deal with a realistic world the way that it is. The Defense Department is the biggest employer. Military and allied military businesses is the #1 employer in the United States. We're dealing with our own financial crisis. And when you start cutting the budget, we're cutting Rockwell Collins. We're cutting the people that make foodstuffs. We had Heinz ketchup, Heinz Industries, with Quality Chef here in Cedar Rapids. They had the contract for the Army macaroni and cheese contract, but it was huge. There's lots and lots and lots of little companies scattered throughout the United States that our economy is military-based. Whether we like it or not is irrelevant. We simply will put ourselves into a huge fiscal crisis if we make drastic cuts in the military.
Yeah, I think the key word there is drastic.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's talking about that. You know, the whole idea of cutting the military is not going from $700 billion, $600 billion, whatever it is, to zero. It's taking a reasonable slice of it and either saving the money and not spending it on something or spending it on something else. And, you know, just from a perspective of what's going on in the world, you can't justify us spending more than half of the world's military budget. Now, you say our country is military-based, our budget, our economy is military-based. Yeah, the military doesn't produce anything. They don't produce any food, they don't produce anything that's useful outside of the military for blowing people up. So I think we'd be able to reallocate a small part of that resource fairly easily to something else, or just save it and kind of reduce this monster deficit.
I don't disagree with you, and there are certain things that for example, the Army is now going to, I saw just today, they're creating a new uniform, a new camouflage uniform, because they don't like the ones that they have. The Navy's work uniform was no longer good because everybody else had cami uniforms, so now the Navy has to have a cami uniform. When the recruiting offices were all in Lindale, you would walk down and you would think you were at a PX on base someplace with all the uniforms, all the cameo uniforms protecting Victoria's Secret and Sears and Roebuck. There are waste aspects. But again, I look at the overall budget and say, we can cut, but, and the number of bases we have is a possibility. But then again, we get right back into Congress, and Congress isn't going to do it.
Well, that's because Congress, of course, is in the employ of the military-industrial complex. I mean, there's a huge lobby, and they contribute a lot to their campaigns. So Congress is always going to go with what the military wants.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with your assessment that Congress is going to go with what the military wants. But on your comment earlier about the military doesn't produce anything, I think there's a lot of things that have come out of advancing the technology that gets carried over from a military or even our space exploration carries over to the civilian world, so that it benefits other areas.
Sure.
So while it may not be a producer of food, there are benefits that come from it. And the one thing that Congress doesn't have a lot of is former veterans and people that served in the military, but yet in the last 200 years, a lot of our terrific leaders have been military born, bred, and educated. So, you know, it's been a wonderful relationship.
Well, I think, Pete, that brings up a very important point is that our quote-unquote elected officials are basically tools of finance. And whoever is giving them the most money are the people they're going to support. And it's a very sad commentary. There are methods. Senator John McCain tried to create some election reforms and was blown out of the water for it.
Okay, we're down to about a minute and a half. Real quick. Steve, anything you've got for final
I think
thoughts?
it's been pretty well discussed.
And something that people need to be aware of?
I think so. And I think, as you said, both parties, both the Republicans and the Democrats, have talked about increasing the
Carl?
defense spending.
Oh, thank you. As I mentioned, I'm a member of the Workers for Peace Iowa, which started off as Women for Peace Iowa just after 9/11. Several local women decided to look at the world differently and search for peace. So many men joined that we changed the title to Workers for Peace Iowa. Charlotte Martin, a religious professor, is the chairperson. We're a small group, but we have a book club that discusses history. We meet at the Bussey Library at Mount Mercy every fourth Tuesday of the month, but we do not reflect necessarily Mount Mercy's views.
Okay. Paul?
Yeah, one last point. I think